Today's lecture is part of our conservation lecture series. View the schedule or register for upcoming lectures and watch videos of past lectures on the website shown on the screen here. And you can also view the schedule, as you can see here, of the upcoming lectures. There will be more added to the schedule as topics and presenters allow. For today's lecture, I ask that audience members please hold your questions until the end. I will come around with a microphone so that those listening on WebEx can hear your questions. And for those on WebEx, we ask you to type your questions into the chat box, and then we will read them at the end for the presenter. So today we are pleased to have Dr. Bob Meese presenting a lecture on tricolored blackbirds. Bob Meese received his PhD in ecology from UC Davis. He has worked at the Information Center for the Environment in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at UC Davis for over 20 years. He has been conducting research on tricolored blackbirds for over a decade, has banned nearly 57,000 of them in 8 years, and helped to develop the Tricolored Blackbird portal hosted by UC Davis. His monitoring and research efforts have helped to locate at-risk colonies in ephemeral habitats, particularly grain fields, identified over 100 new breeding locations, found that reproductive success is highly correlated with insect abundance, and has documented a severe decline in abundance. His banding studies have found that some birds breed 3 times per year. Reciprocal movements exist between Central Valley and the coast. Birds may occasionally move from the Central Valley into Southern California, and that birds may move together through space and time. Bob's work has taken him from San Diego County to Butte County, with a focus on the Central Valley from Kern County to Glenn County. Bob served as a statewide coordinator for the 2014 Tricolored Blackbird Statewide Survey. Prior to his work with tricolors, Bob served as a member of the peregrine falcon recovery team for the Colorado Division of Wildlife and is currently a member of the World Commission on Protected Areas, an international network of protected area expertise administered by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, with 100 members in 140 countries. Bob has taught undergraduate courses and graduate seminars at Sacramento State University and UC Davis. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Meese.
Virulent is cranked up to be, so my voice isn't what I would hope, but I think I'll be able to get through the next hour. I hope so. This is not my first time presenting here at the department. 3.5 years ago, in October of 2011, I was invited to come in by Leanne Comrack, who is a non-game bird biologist, and the reason that she wanted me to come in and present to the staff of the department was because she was confident that I understood that California's blackbird, the tricolor, was in trouble, and she wanted me to present my evidence for the fact that tricolors were in trouble to department staff, and I'm glad to see some of the people that were present 3.5 years ago present today, second time, and I would hope that the one thing that we can all agree to by the end of the decline in abundance in tricolored blackbirds real? Nothing to do with birds simply moving out of California. There is absolutely no evidence to suggest that birds have left California and taken up residence in some other state. And until we get on the same page and we all agree to the simple fact that the decline in abundance, which is severe, is real, I don't really have that much confidence that we're going to be able to take the steps that are going to be necessary to try to restore the species. So hopefully in the next hour or so, if you're somewhat skeptical as to whether or not the decline in abundance is real, I hope to be able to convince you that it is. So the first thing I would like to do is to acknowledge the fact that over my now going on 11 years of work with the species, I've had the support of numerous agencies and groups, including U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, this department, a foundation in Oregon called the Gigi Foundation, which is supporting my work again this year. Audubon, California, Sacramento Audubon, Geyer and Associates, which supported me in 2005. I want to acknowledge the fact that a lot of the work that I do is done on private property. I have gotten to know some really, really fascinating people all over California who have been extraordinarily gracious to me in allowing me access to their ranches and dairies pretty much 24/7. They put very few constraints on me as to when I can be on their land. Lots of agency staff and volunteer observers have helped to inform me about the presence of birds and movements of birds, and also a lot of agency staff and volunteers have helped me to band birds. I'm not going to be talking much about my banding today. I banded just under 57,000 tricolors so far, and there's some really, really interesting stuff that we talked about with respect to the results of that effort, but that's not the subject of today's talk. So today I'll be talking specifically about conservation efforts and recovery, beginning with a review of the natural history and field identification of tricolored blackbirds, try to convince you that they are indeed special, and highlight some of the characteristics of the species that I believe makes them special, talk about the trends over the past century, which include trends both abundance and in distribution, talk about what I believe to be the factors that are producing those trends, the current legal status of the species, which has radically changed in the last several weeks, and talk about how we might succeed in recovering the tricolor to something, I wouldn't say resembling its former abundance, but maybe the abundance of several decades ago, and a brief mention of what the future prospects might be. Regarding natural history of tricolored blackbirds, it is California's blackbird. Over 99% of all the tricolors in the world occur within the boundaries of our state. They are highly sexually dimorphic in size, plumage, and behavior. The males average about 65 to 70 grams, females about 40, so the males are quite a bit larger, about 50% larger than females. The males are glossy black. The word glossy is important. Have a bright red epaulet and white wing bar. Females are very dull brown or gray, heavily streaked ventrally, and have lesser amounts of color in the wing. And the males attract settling females. They typically occur at a breeding location first, a day to 3 days before the females. One male normally breeds with 2 females on average. The males do not help to build the nest, nor do they incubate the eggs, but they do help to feed the young. I would like to point out that I did make one observation in 2006 of one male tricolored blackbird, which took grass, picked it up, and offered it to his mate. So there was one bird one time that did pick up a piece of grass. That essentially helped, right? Helping the female build the nest. That's only happened that one time. So typically they don't. So these are male tricolored blackbirds. Photograph on the left taken by me. Photograph on the right taken by Morgan Ball. Note, both birds are extremely glossy in their plumage. That is a characteristic of tricolors. It is not a characteristic of red wings. Okay, so that is diagnostic. And note the color of the epaulet. It is a blood red, a scarlet red, not an orange red as in the red-winged blackbird. So the red-winged blackbird, the name itself is really not quite accurate. It's really not a red wing. It's got an orange-red epaulet. And then the wing bar is snow white. It's not tan or buffy or gold as it is in the red wing when it's present. Some subspecies of red wings don't even have a wing bar at all. They just have the orange-red epaulet. But the main thing is really the very glossy plumage. So here are 2 female tricolored blackbirds. The photo on the right is probably one of the best I've ever seen of the species. The main thing to notice on the photo on the right is how the streaks on the breast merge on the belly, so that the belly is a uniform chocolate brown. Red wing streaks, they keep going all the way through the belly. They never merge to form a chocolate brown belly. Okay? So the fact that those streaks are merging as you look at the ventral surface of that female, that is diagnostic of the female tricolor. The streaks on the belly of the red-winged female continue. I want to show you a particular female that I captured at Kern National Wildlife Refuge in 2008. If you look at a standard field guide, the standard field guide in describing the female tricolored blackbird will say something like, female tricolored blackbirds lack color in the wings. This is a female tricolored blackbird. That is probably age-related. She's probably about 5 or 6 years old. I can't prove that, but I suspect it. And there are definitely a lot of very brightly colored female tricolored blackbirds in California. So the standard field guides on that particular trait are incorrect. Many female tricolors have lots of color in the wings. There is one feature on this plate which is taken from the Sibley guide. I guess I should have noted that, but I've just told you anyway. It's not my plate, it's Alan Sibley's. The bird on the left is the adult male tricolor bird on the right, male redwing. If you look at the shape of the wingtip, they're different. The tricolor wingtip is much more pointed. The redwing wingtip is much more blunt or rounded. And once you've seen a bunch of them in the field, you can tell the difference. Just one bird going by, if it's relatively pointy-winged, it's a tricolor. If it's relatively blunt, round-winged, redwing. But having said all of the above, what is the best way to discriminate between tricolors and redwings? No plumage characteristic trumps this. See that anywhere in California from about the second half of February, right now, until the early part of September, there's only one bird you're looking at. There's no other species with that. Redwings don't do it. Brewers don't do it. Only one, tricolors. So if you see that, you're looking at tricolored blackbirds. You don't need to look at the wings. You don't need to look for glossy plumage. If you see this, it's tricolors. Almost all of those birds are females. I'll be talking later about how I know. This picture was taken on a private cattle ranch in Merced County a number of years ago. That is a foraging flock, by the way. That is not a colony. That's probably about 2,000 or 3,000 birds. The colony was 83,000. The distribution of the two species couldn't be more different. In this case, redwings on the left, tricolors on the right. Redwings occur all the way from Alaska, all the way down to Central America. Tricolors are almost exclusively limited to California. There's a few hundred left in northern Baja. There's a single colony of typically somewhere around 40 to 60 birds in far western Nevada, just over the border. There's about 5 or 6 locations where there's a few hundred birds scattered in Oregon, and there's a single place in Walla Walla, very near Walla Walla, Washington, where there's a very stable number of around 60 tricolors, and that's it. So way over 99% of all the birds are here in California. The range in size and weight of redwings versus tricolors is much, much greater. I'm assuming those really lightweight birds are the ones in Central America. For the redwings, the very heavy birds are probably the northern birds up in Canada and Alaska. You can see the range of tricolors is much narrower for the males and for the females. 26 named subspecies of redwings. Incredibly diverse because of the wide range. No subspecies recognized tricolors. Redwings are highly territorial. Tricolors are highly colonial. I've already talked about the fact that redwings are found all over the place, extremely widespread. One of the most, if not the single most abundant bird in North America. And the tricolor almost endemic, and then super abundant and much reduced abundance, especially in the last 6 years for the tricolor. Nest building takes about 3 or 4 days, only by the females, made out of grass and mud. They typically lay 3 or 4 eggs. The first clutch is almost always 4 eggs. The second clutch is almost always 3. The nests are built in a very wide variety of substrates, and if you look at that list, the cattails and bulrushes are both native. Himalayan blackberries are introduced. Nettles are native. Milk thistle introduced. Triticale, obviously introduced. Mustard introduced. Mallow introduced. Rhododendron introduced. So they nest in a lot of non-native plant types, a lot, and only a few native plant types. Incubation of the eggs takes typically 12 days. Fledging can take 10 to 14. It's curious because if you disturb the colony a lot, the fledging takes closer to 10 days. if you leave the colony alone, it's very undisturbed. The fledging takes closer to 14 days, so the kids tend to stay at home longer, not disturbed. They tend to get out of Dodge and leave the nest and get out into the real world earlier if there's disturbance of the colony. They are brood reducers, which means that the female assesses how many young she thinks that she can support, and typically very early on, within about days, maybe 3, after the last egg has hatched, if she has already concluded that she cannot rear all of the young from the eggs that have hatched, she starts taking out the surplus young that she can't rear, and she drops them on the ground in what becomes essentially cemeteries or Tricolored Blackbird nestling. It's an exceedingly unpleasant thing to watch. I've seen it all over the place, and it's really unpleasant. And I saw it on a really interesting ranch in Sacramento County in 2013, and I was shocked at the distance that the females were flying. They were all putting their quote, surplus young, the young they didn't think they could rear in the same place. Nestlings that are kind of bouncing around on the ground for a few hours until they die, so it's very, very unpleasant. But that is brood reduction. They also practice what's called itinerant breeding, which in this case means that they typically, the birds in the Central Valley, they typically breed in the San Joaquin Valley in March and April, and then fly up into the Sacramento Valley sometime in the second half of May, and then they breed again in the Sacramento Valley. So 2 different breeding attempts, 2 different places. I do have banding evidence that some females are triple brooded. They try to breed 3 times in a breeding season, which is utterly remarkable in my opinion. If you think about where the minerals or the eggshells come from, ultimately, yes, it comes from the diet, but in real time, when they're laying eggs, where does the calcium and phosphorus salts come from that go into the eggshells? Skeleton. So if you think about 3 clutches of eggs, I would love to have knowledge of what that female was in terms of weight and measurements in March, and in measurements again after she's bred 3 times in, say, August. I have to believe she'd be much smaller and much lighter after taking all of those minerals from her skeleton, sticking them into her eggs, 3 clutches of eggs. Some of them do. Not too many, probably 10% or something like that, but some of the females do try to breed 3 times in one season. So that's what a Tricolored Blackbird nest looks like. That substrate is triticale. It's that hybrid grain that dairymen grow. And there's your typical clutch size of 4. The eggs are got one sort of a blunt end and one pointy end. And the curious thing is they have these red speckles on them. And the red speckles are always on the blunt end. They're never on the pointy end. You can explain to me why that might be, because I don't have a clue. But always it's the pointy end that's immaculate, which is blue. I've seen green eggs also, but 90% of them are light blue. And the speckling that's kind of a mahogany color is always on the blunt end. There's only 3 requirements for breeding. And those 3 requirements are a nesting substrate. We've already talked about how diverse they can be. They require open water, and that's for both drinking and for bathing. The other thing they need the water for, which is kind of interesting to watch, is to wet the grass. Think about it. If you are using your mouth to weave a nest in cattails, and you were using dried grass, how easy would that be? Not very. How about if you're using wet grass? Much easier. So the females, they take dry grass, they take it over to a source of water, they dunk it in the water, they make it wet, then they use it to weave and make a nest. And finally, food. And the food gets interesting because they require insects. Females require insects to form eggs, and the nestlings require insects for the first 9 days of life. They do not eat any plant matter for the first 9 days, 100% animal matter. The other times of year, they eat primarily seeds and grains, and they are very, very often in 21st century California found in association with livestock because that's where a lot of brains can be found. Oh, shoot. Those of you who have never heard, do this for a few days after you look at the map. 5 species of Agelaius, only 2 of which are females and silent. Red-winged and tricolor, the females are silent, male same. The other 3 species are species. Sounds like cats, right? Okay. Regarding foraging, almost all of it occurs within about a 6-kilometer radius of the colony, and the insects that they require are frequently derived from relatively small but very highly productive habitats. And those habitats do include agricultural landscapes, and in an agricultural landscape, the 2 best crops for tricolors in terms of providing insects are alfalfa and sunflowers. And in a non-agricultural landscape, remnant shrublands are usually the most productive, and they are especially productive when caterpillars are abundant. There was a painted lady butterfly outbreak in 2005. Those of you who were around in 2005, if you remember, I even remember walking out of my house in Davis, there would be thousands of butterflies going by in any point in time in April and May. I'd never seen anything like it before, haven't seen it again since. But that was a painted lady butterfly outbreak year, and probably about 90% of what the tricolored blackbirds in the Central Valley were eating that year were painted lady butterfly caterpillars. So they love to eat caterpillars and grasshoppers. The exceptions to their focusing on these highly productive habitats are when they're breeding in grasslands or in a area like the Sacramento Valley, which is dominated by rice, in which case they forage very widely. They do not concentrate on small habitat patches. And they've been described since the 1960s as being grasshopper followers. And that simply means that where grasshoppers are superabundant, tricolored blackbirds do exceedingly well. They tend to have a very high reproductive success when grasshoppers are extremely abundant. And they utilize an extraordinarily wide range of foraging tactics. And what I mean by that is, in a typical situation, they will forage in open rangelands. That's sort of their native foraging habitat. In the Sacramento Valley, which is dominated by rice, they actually go into rice paddies, and they go and forage exactly like a shorebird would. They wade in water, just like a shorebird. They stick their heads under the water, and they stick their bills in the mud, and they look for larval insects in the mud, just like a shorebird would. Along the coast, in Monterey County, they forage in the boughs of coast live oak trees, like a warbler. When there's a aquatic insect hatch, and there's insects by the thousands flying 100 feet or so above an aquatic environment, they forage just like a flycatcher. Same species. Just doing things in different ways, because for a period of hours or days or weeks, a certain type of insect becomes superabundant. And when it becomes superabundant, that becomes its food source. So they forage in more and different types of ways than probably any other North American bird. So I'm going to summarize now what makes tricolors special. And the fact that they're colonial makes them special or unique. The fact that they're a restricted range makes them special or unique. They are highly insectivorous during the breeding season, which makes them not terribly unique. There's a lot of other bird species where the females become insectivorous in order to lay eggs. They are itinerant breeders, which is pretty unusual for birds. And they do utilize that very highly diverse range of foraging tactics. So those are the things that I consider make a tricolor and make it unlike any other bird species, let alone any other blackbird species. Okay.
Now, considering the population trend, especially considering the recent population trend, obviously nobody was here prior to Columbus's arrival who was interested in tricolored blackbirds, so we don't have any information about how many there were. The first person to actually professionally study tricolored blackbirds, a guy by the name of Johnson Neff. He worked from 1931 to 1936, primarily in the Sacramento Valley, but to some extent in the northern San Joaquin. And if you extrapolate from his estimates of nests, you can easily get to a population throughout the state that would have been at least 2 to 3 million birds as recently as the 1930s. There was an effort that was initiated by Ted Beatty and Bill Hamilton in 1993 to come up with a new tool, a new method by which we assessed how many birds there were in the state. That's called the Statewide Survey. And the estimates derived from the statewide surveys that were conducted between 1994 and 2005 were pretty much all over the map. So I am not going to be comparing the results from those surveys because of the differences that you see on the screen in front of you. They were just radically different from one survey to the next in terms of how they were conducted. So I'm not going to be comparing them. But the statewide survey methodology changed rather dramatically in 2008. And also there was the development of what is called the Tricolored Blackbird portal. And as a result of a very much improved and now standardized survey methodology, plus the development of the portal, the statewide surveys that were conducted in 2008, 11, and 14 are directly comparable, and there's the results. Depressing. They haven't moved. They haven't moved. There's fewer birds. Here's proof. The blue bars in the graph indicate the number of sites surveyed. Okay, the graph at the top. This is a very ugly slide. I apologize for it, but I just couldn't make it beautiful, so I'm showing it anyway. So the graph at the top, the blue bars are the number of sites surveyed. Look what happened from 2008 on in terms of the height of those bars. Why is that? Because of the portal. If you give Californians a web-based data entry tool, they will use it. We had over 77 different people enter location records this year alone because of the portal. We give people access to a web-based data entry tool, they will use it. So look at that rapid increase in knowledge of where these birds are breeding. The kind of orangish, burnt orange bars, those are the number of occupied sites. Look at how the height of those bars just refuses to budge. Pretty much between about 120 and 150 year after year. Almost doesn't change. Right? So the increase in knowledge of where the birds are just has skyrocketed in the last 6 years. From only 361 sites surveyed in 2008 to 802 last year. And yet look at how steady the number of occupied sites is. By the way, when I surveyed on April 18th with Neil and another colleague, we participated in day one of the 3-day statewide survey in April last year. We saw one bird on the Conaway Ranch in Yolo County. One bird means the site was occupied. So that is one of the whatever it was, 143 occupied locations. So even though it's only one bird, it counts as being occupied. There has to be no birds in order for it to be unoccupied. Also, if you look at the little tabulated number of counties surveyed below the graph, you see that we actually increased rather dramatically our geographic coverage. 41 counties were covered last year in the statewide survey. So the birds haven't moved. They're gone. What is the current legal status? As you probably know, The Fish and Game Commission voted very recently to list the tricolor as endangered, and the Center for Biological Diversity has very recently petitioned, earlier this month in fact, the federal government to list the species as endangered, also under the Endangered Species Act, Federal Endangered Species Act. Right now it is currently protected under the MBTA, Migratory Bird Treaty Act. That's a federal species of conservation concern. And that gorgeous photo on the bottom was taken in, I believe, 2008 in Merced County. We had a little bit more snow that winter, I think. Nice picture, right? You're going to see it again shortly. Regarding distribution, what we're seeing is essentially the fabric of tricolored blackbird distribution fraying. There's starting to be gaps, where there's either no birds or very, very few birds. And a century ago, it was the single most abundant bird species in the Los Angeles, San Diego region. By no means is it the most abundant bird species now. There were only 12,000 birds seen in all of Southern California in April of last year. It had been absent from Orange and Ventura counties. There was a colony consisting of 7 birds seen in Ventura County in April of last year. First time birds have been reported breeding in Ventura County in 20 years. There was a 91% reduction in abundance in the 6 coastal counties, all the way from San Francisco all the way down to Santa Barbara. Less than 700 birds seen in 6 counties, 673. Yeah, they're winking out. They haven't moved. The gaps in the distribution of the Central Valley, they've been almost eliminated, not totally, but almost, from both Kings and San Joaquin County. There was 1 colony in Kings County last year and 1 colony in San Joaquin County last year. It's interesting because the San Joaquin County colony was in a location that didn't exist the year before. It was in a gravel mining operation that was being restored. There was a little cattail marsh that popped up. And cattail marshes are exceedingly attractive, especially when they're young and fresh, to breeding birds. And they found it, and they moved in, and they bred there last year. First time since '04 that any breeding had been known in San Joaquin County. And there's been a 78% reduction in abundance in only 6 years in the entire San Joaquin Valley, which used to be really ground zero, if you will. It used to be that's where the core of the species was found. Species was most densely found, and it still is, but far fewer numbers in San Joaquin Valley. So what are the factors that are causing the population decline? By far and away, the number one most serious factor is loss of habitat. Land conversions due to both agriculture and urbanization, but far, far more due to agriculture, except in Southern California, where both urbanization and more recently alternative energy development are having pretty dramatic impacts on the species. Historically, water diversions and overdrafts have caused massive losses of former wetland habitats. Up until the early 70s, there were all kinds of really nasty pesticides being used that were poisoning a lot of blackbird species, including tricolors. And there remains a problem with shooting. There used to be market shooting. In the, I think, 30s through the 40s, there were hundreds of thousands of tricolored blackbirds per year that were shot in the Central Valley and taken to market for sale in the San Francisco Bay Area for feeding humans. And they are supposed to be protected under the MBTA, but in the fall, they occur in multi-species foraging flocks with red-winged blackbirds, with brewer's blackbirds, with European starlings, maybe 1 or 2 other species, none of which receive protections under the MBTA if they are causing or are about to cause depredations to crops. And farmers may legally go in and shoot blackbirds. But now that the tricolor is endangered, if that blackbird shot, that the blackbird flock that is shot at includes tricolors and tricolors are killed, then that's considered take under CISA. So it would probably be a good idea to revisit the MBTA and to maybe modify it so that no blackbirds get shot in the fall in California. And another ongoing major problem with mortality involves the harvest of the triticale-based grain field nesting substrates around dairies in the San Joaquin Valley and in Riverside County in Southern California. And hopefully now that the species is listed, that will cease. But up until last year, there were a minimum of 2 colonies that I know of in Merced County that were both lost due to harvest. So what happens is the birds come in, they set up adjacent to a dairy in a field of triticale, which is grown by the farmer to feed his dairy cows. And right at the time when the grain is ready to be harvested and the young are almost ready to fledge, the farmer comes in and harvests the field, and all the eggs and or nestlings that are in the nest are killed. And I just want to mention the potential role of pesticides. It has never been investigated, and it could potentially be huge. And I'll give you a very, what may on the surface seem silly reason why I'm concerned, but it's perfectly scientific. My field vehicle is a very old Nissan Quest minivan. And the reason that I tell you this is because usually starting in early April, my field season starts. This year it's going to start earlier. And I drive from Davis to Lost Hills, which is basically a truck stop by the side of the road in Kern County, just to the west of I-5. And in 2005 and 2006, I would go to the ARCO station in Lost Hills, and I'd put the gas in the tank, and then I would grab the squeegee, and I would go to my windshield, and I would just clean the windshield. There were so many carcasses of insects on my windshield, I could barely see out of it. In 2007, I went through the same steps. I grabbed the squeegee, and I looked at my windshield, and there was nothing there. Nothing to clean. 2008, same thing. 2009, same thing. 2010, same thing. 2011, same thing. What happened? I've spoken to colleagues on campus. I've asked them, have you ever noticed anything different about the number of bugs on your windshield? Because I have colleagues that commute from outside of Davis. Between 2006 and 2007, 3 different people looked at me. They said, yes! Up until 2006, I used to have to clean my windshield at least once a week. Ever since 2007, maybe every few months. Something happened. Nobody was studying it. Nobody's looking for it. The people that I want to talk to are the truckers. I want to ask the truckers who go up and down I-5, hey, did you guys ever notice something that happened to your windshields from the winter of 2006 until the spring of 2007? Because my windshield noticed it. And I would like to know if truckers' windshields noticed it too, because if the answer is yes, there would be hundreds and hundreds of people saying, yep, I saw exactly the same thing. And if the answer is yes, there's something going on. We just don't know what it is. But the tricolors have not bred successfully, except in exceedingly rare instances, since 2006. And I am the only one who knows it because I'm the only one who's out there studying it. Something happened. 2006, 2005 were fabulous years for Tricolored Blackbird reproductive success. There was a colony in Kern County, 2006, 138,000 birds in one field. 132,000 young fledged, one field, one colony. The largest colony in 2013 and 2014, 22,000. 138,000 in 2006, 22,000, 2013, 2014. The birds haven't moved. They're gone. They're going. They haven't moved. They're not in Oregon. They're not in Nevada. They're gone. Okay. This is pretty intense. Gorgeous, right? California. Why we all love to live here. Beautiful scene, right? Beautiful male tricolored blackbird flying over. Actually, it's a weedy field. It's got you name it in there. It's got mustard. It's got a little bit of oats. It's got milk thistle. It's got fiddlehead. I mean, it's just a weedy, weedy, weedy field. Snow in the mountains, right? 2 weeks later, same spot. Yep, silence. Not beautiful anymore, right? Okay, something else happened. Gone forever. Gone forever. There will never be tricolored blackbirds in that field ever again. Almonds, yes. Tricolored blackbirds, no. This has happened thousands of times up and down the Central Valley. That's exactly the same place. Look at those utility poles, see? 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Not working. It's literally not working. What happened? One, two, three, four. Same utility poles. Same spot. Happened. Central Valley facts. We all know what Central Valley is. Nation's breadbasket, right? Lots and lots of crops grown, tens of thousands of acres of different things. 25% of the table food consumed comes from the Central Valley. All I want you to see from the two panels, the panel on the left has certain colors that are not represented on the panel on the right. Why is that? Because they represent, panel on the left is pre-1900, panel on the right is current, which I believe was about 2012 or 13. We've turned it into the nation's breadbasket. So the only thing I want you to see from this panel is what you probably already know intuitively, which is that we've transformed the Central Valley from what it had been to what it is currently. Different place. So one way of looking at this is a graph of increase in almond acreage planted in several decades in a single county. Another way to think about it is pistachios on the landscape. And if you think, boy, that doesn't really look like a good place for tricolored blackbirds, you're right. It's not. Where you see orchards, you don't see tricolored blackbirds. Vineyards, same thing. Remember, orchards and vineyards, perennial crops. Perennial crops offer literally no resources for tricolored blackbird breeding. Nothing. No insects, no nesting, no anything. Dairies, yes. That's the conflict. That's a field of triticale, tricolored blackbird, part of a colony, most of a colony, taken in Kern County in 2006. And those are the barns where the dairy cows are underneath. And up here in the Sacramento Valley, rice. So the tricolored blackbirds try to make a living in this landscape, but it's not easy. That's not what they evolved in. Okay. Regarding the harvest in the field of triticale. Plainsburg Road in Merced County. That field is now pistachios. No longer is it triticale. That's what the harvest of a triticale colony looks like. Regarding the shooting in autumn, they do flock together with multiple blackbird species and with European starlings. And as I mentioned, these other blackbird species and starlings are not protected under the MBTA when they're causing or about to cause depredations, and therefore there's an unknown number of tricolors being shot. These are post-breeding adults. These are by far the most valuable birds in the entire population. These are the birds that are being shot in primarily September and October. And again, we probably need some sort of a regulatory change in order to put an end to the autumnal shooting of blackbirds because of the fact that you cannot shoot and kill one species without shooting individuals of the other species. It's just impossible. They're all together. So what is it going to take to recover tricolored blackbirds? It's going to be difficult. The reason that it's going to be difficult is because of the primary driver. The primary driver is habitat loss. And it's unlikely that we're going to take almond orchards or rice paddies or fields of triticale out. Once we put them in, they're probably going to stay there. So we've got to come up with some other means to try to recover the species. So we need strategic choices and strategic locations. And I'll give you some examples of things that might work. In the San Joaquin Valley, there's, I wouldn't say numerous, but there's quite a few private duck clubs. And if we can work with a private duck club owner to manage his duck club in such a way that it's of benefit both to ducks and to tricolored blackbirds, and then adjacent to that duck club there are large fields of alfalfa, and we can talk to the farmer or the landowner and offer to pay that farmer not to spray until, say, the middle of May, that alfalfa field will have more than enough insects to support the breeding of the tricolors in the nearby duck club. That's one scenario that might work in, say, Kern and Kings Canyon or Kings counties. Another example, if you go up to Merced County, you could have a national wildlife refuge like Merced National Wildlife Refuge, which would provide both the water and the nesting substrate. And there's a lot of big cattle ranches nearby. So there's another potential place where you could make a strategic choice in a strategic location. And also in places like Madera County and in Merced County, you can talk to dairymen. And I sat down with a dairyman last winter in Merced County across the street from that place that I showed you, the series of 3 slides, the one starting off beautiful with the snow in the background and the whole bit, and then it got destroyed by harvest. Even though it was a weedy field, there's nothing of commercial value there at all, and now it's almonds. We tried to negotiate with the dairyman to actually provide a field of triticale as nesting substrate to attract birds, and he doesn't have a history of growing triticale, and he won't do it. But that would be another scenario where you could actually talk to a dairyman, pay the dairyman to plant something that would be sort of a lure crop that would attract nesting birds, as long as there was adjacent rangelands, as is the case in this particular location in Merced County. So for San Joaquin Valley, those are examples. In the Sacramento Valley, the big issue here is rice. The wildlife areas, both state and federal, are essentially habitat islands in a sea of rice. And there's a major question. Almost all the rice, not literally all of it, most of it is grown commercially, which means there's liquid insecticides that are put into the water that goes into the rice paddies, and it kills off all the insects. So one scenario is to have organically grown rice. And people who have worked with me banding birds on the Conaway Ranch know that when tricolored blackbirds forage in organically grown rice in the rice paddies, they find a lot to eat. There's a lot of insects in the mud, and they do very well. So that's another scenario in an agricultural landscape. In Yuba County, I'm working with a landowner currently on a kind of a hybrid ranch and rice farm, and she had between 25 and 33% of all the tricolored blackbirds in the world on her ranch last summer. 5 different colonies on one private ranch. And that would be a place, and that's why we're trying to put it under conservation easement to protect it for tricolored blackbirds and to keep it in its current state. In Southern California, there's really not that much we can do. Everything has pretty much been paved over, and now we've got alternative energy projects going in everywhere, and that's another huge conflict with tricolored blackbird conservation and restoration. There are examples of what are usually called man-made wetlands, things like water treatment facilities and flood protection areas. There was a case in Riverside County last year where there was a flood protection area that had a very fresh cattail marsh, and the birds moved into it. And they actually, I don't know how they did it, but they flew, I believe it was 3 miles each way over heavily urbanized Southern California to forage in alfalfa. I don't know how they found the alfalfa, but they had to fly over freeway after freeway after freeway from this little wetland area where they were breeding to find the insects in the alfalfa 3 miles away. So that's another scenario, but our options are few in Southern California. There's not too much left. Along the coast, that's where we had the 91% reduction in abundance just in 6 years. And about the best we can do there is, I think, to work with private landowners and to try to get them to enhance things like stock ponds on their properties, because that's typically where the birds are breeding. They're breeding in small freshwater marshes, and try to enhance and manage those properly for tricolored blackbirds. And I don't know exactly what we might be able to do, but there is possibly potential for increasing foraging opportunities in grasslands, and certainly we want to do everything that we possibly can to conserve the caterpillars that occur in the coast live oaks, because that's pretty much most of what they eat in most years, at least in Monterey County. Things in the foothills are actually pretty good. There's been a 25% increase in abundance in the last 6 years rather than a decrease. That's where the dominant land use is cattle grazing or cattle ranching, and that's a very mutualistic type of a relationship between the cattle and the birds, because the cattle need the grass, and the grasshoppers eat the grass, so they compete with the cattle for the grass. But if you have nesting tricolored blackbirds that are eating the grasshoppers, then there's more grass because there's fewer grasshoppers removing grass. So there's a very good mutualism going on there, and there is potential for expanding nesting habitats. I don't think that all of the birds that could fit in California's rangelands are currently there, and I think that nesting substrates are probably limiting. We need an awful lot more education and outreach. There are some really odd opinions out there regarding tricolored blackbirds. I had a colleague on campus just last winter when I met him in the hall. We had a conversation about, quote, my birds. And he said, Bob, aren't tricolors just a subspecies of redwings? And I looked at him and, no. So if somebody with a PhD who works at UC Davis is confused as to exactly what the status of California's blackbird is, then we're in a little bit of trouble. So we do need a lot more education and outreach. Over lunch today, we were talking about safe harbor agreements, and one thing we really, really need to do, especially in the foothills, is to make the ranchers very, very confident that there are absolutely no conflicts in what they're doing with tricolored blackbird conservation and restoration. There are zero conflicts. As a matter of fact, what the ranchers are doing is hugely beneficial to tricolored blackbird conservation, and that needs to be very, very well known to that group, to all the ranchers in California. But other groups that need to be sought out and talked to and sort of brought up to speed with what needs to be done to try to restore tricolored blackbird include dairymen, Resource Conservation District staff, and county ag commissioners. All of those different constituent groups need to be brought up to speed with what's going on with tricolors. There almost certainly need to be some legal steps taken in the next months or couple of years, in particular to try to eliminate that post-breeding mortality that I talked about with birds foraging with other blackbird species and ripening rice in September and October. Just to give you a single factoid, there was a single ranch in Shasta County in 2012. Well, there were reported that this was by a federal staff person. He reported in one of his required annual reports in excess of 10,800 red-winged blackbirds that he shot off of a rice farm. Can I see by a show of hands how many people believe that all 10,800 red-winged blackbirds were red-winged blackbirds? Yeah. Impossible. There are no pure red-winged blackbird flocks in October in Shasta County. It doesn't exist. That's just not the way the world works. So how many of those were tricolors? Who knows? Nobody checked. But that gives you an example, single example, N of 1, sample size of 1, over 10,000, just under 11,000 red-winged blackbirds shot from a single rice growing operation in one county in 2012. So it's a pretty big conflict. And we need to do a lot more review of the existing and under consideration county general plans and habitat conservation plans and other types of plans that are ongoing which might have impacts on tricolored blackbirds and their ability to reproduce. Regarding the future, unfortunately, I cannot be really optimistic. And that's because I've been living with these birds now for several months out of the year. This is my 11th field season. I'm 100% sure, not 99.9, 100% sure that the decline is ongoing. We have not reached the bottom. If you look at the rate of the decline in the last 3 years, it has accelerated over the previous 3 years. And I know for a fact that the number of young fledged in the last 3 years has been the lowest that's ever been recorded in a 3-year interval. So you just do the back of the envelope calculation. If they're not reproducing themselves year after year, the population is going to collapse. One last time, they have not moved. A lot of people ask me about the drought. What are the effects of the drought? They can only be bad. The ongoing drought is making any effort that we might make to restore the species more difficult. It can only be doing bad things to insect populations. I don't know of any evidence to suggest that having a long-term drought somehow increases insect abundance. And a really disturbing fact regarding the species over the past, since 2007, population biologists have what they refer to as a stable age distribution for most natural species. And basically what that means is that most of the individuals in any natural population are young individuals. And as you get towards the older age classes, there's fewer and fewer individuals in the population. So if you look at 100% of, in this case, tricolored blackbirds, and you have a graph over time, say 10 years, most of the birds should be like 1 or 2 years old. And then if you get down to a 10-year-old bird, there should be very few of them, right? That's the way it should work. Now, eliminate reproduction starting in 2007. You've got fabulous reproduction in 2005 and 2006. What happens to your stable age distribution? Those young birds don't exist. And now the hump is in the second year. The year after that, the hump is in third year, because you're not reproducing any birds. You don't have any 1 or 2 year old birds, right? So the hump moves through time, but what's the height of the hump doing? It's getting lower and lower, because the birds are getting older and older. That's what we're seeing. When I was here 3.5 years ago at Leanne Comrack's invitation, I predicted this. It's easy stuff, because if you're out in the field with the birds and you're not seeing any young being produced, if the adults are not reproducing themselves, the age distribution is not stable. It's moving through time like a wave, and it's going to fall off a cliff. That's what we're seeing. That's what we've seen. And when we do the statewide survey again in 2017, it'll be worse. It's going to be a lot worse. We had 145,000 birds seen in April of 2014. We're going to try to get an estimate based upon a statistical sample this year, but we're going to do the next statewide survey in 2017. It's going to be alarming to a lot of people. Not that 145,000 birds is not alarming, but the 2017 result will be worse. I can guarantee you it'll be worse. So the near-term outlook is bleak. We need a huge, huge increase in reproductive success, many, many more young produced. So we're getting started pretty late. When I started working with the birds, there was somewhere way beyond 400,000 of them. Now there's 145,000 or fewer. That was in April of last year, so there's fewer than 145,000 now. On-the-ground actions must start now. I've already talked about what some of those might be. Absolutely, we need to eliminate all known man-caused mortality. And we just have to have a lot more young produced, period. Many, many more young tricolors have to be produced. So I talked about the need for strategically chosen actions and strategically chosen locations. And what works in Southern California is not going to work in Kern County. And what works in Kern County is not going to work in Glenn County. So everything that we do, we have to tailor it to a local, almost a site-by-site, and if not site-by-site, then county-by-county consideration. And the focus needs to be on where the birds were most abundant in the most recent past. And that means Southern California and the San Joaquin Valley. That's where the birds were most abundant most recently. And Southern California is in dire straits. We have very, very few options down there. But the San Joaquin Valley, if we get started, if we can bring a lot of money to bear and talk to some sympathetic landowners to start doing some appropriate management activities, we can make great headway very quickly. But we have to do some things differently than we're doing right now. And we definitely need what I'm referring to as an all-hands-on-deck approach that includes literally everybody, all the interest groups. We've got to have industry support and participation. We already have the support of many landowners. We need a lot more support at the level of resource conservation districts, and that includes a lot of individual counties and state and federal agencies, including this agency, and experts and public and private protected areas, including Department of Defense. There's a lot of examples all up and down California where DoD properties, including places like Livermore National Lab, they have a tricolor colony, and their biologists will be participating in the survey that we're going to do in April this year. State wildlife areas have a large role to play and are playing a large role currently. National wildlife refuges and private ranches, everybody. All hands on deck. Everybody's going to have to do something. The Tricolored Blackbird portal is tricolor.ice.ucdavis.edu. If you do not have and you would like to have an account, we used to not have it password protected, and that turned out to be a huge mistake. You would not believe how many records of massage parlors got entered onto the portal before we had it password protected. And that wasn't the goal, to have records of massage parlors on the portal. But that is what happened. So if you ever develop a database that's publicly accessible, expect some really odd stuff to be entered into your database. So now it's password protected and you need an account. So if you need an account, send me an email and I'll get you set up. Oop, you know what? Oh, I'm just going to stop. My last slide somehow just disappeared. That's it. So I'm more than happy to take questions. My voice has
Questions?
taken me this far. I think I can do it for another hour or whatever.
Hi, my name is Angela Caldwell. I work here in the North Central region for the department. I just had a question. You mentioned in Southern California that they foraged about around 3 miles.
Yes.
Do you have a typical and maybe a max foraging distance, and was it different in different places throughout California?
Well, there is one confirmed case of birds traveling 9 miles. That probably will never be repeated again. That was back, I believe, in the 1980s. And if the birds know of a place, my personal max, kilometers, not miles. That was one place in 2005 in Kern County. And remember I talked about the painted lady outbreak? That was 2005. And there was this shrubland, and And I laughed because I was driving the truck, and I was with Bill Hamilton. He was watching. I was driving his truck. And we were driving on this road on this protected area, this protected shrub area. And we were flying along a foraging flight line. Tricolors forage in absolutely persistent straight line. You go from the colony to the insect source and back again, straight line. Just so happened that the straight line paralleled the road. It wasn't really a road, it was a little dirt track, but anyway. So we were able to follow the birds 9.2 kilometers, and we got out of the truck, and you could stand right in among the shrubs, among the foraging birds, and they'd look up at you, and they'd keep going, and they'd fill their bills with caterpillars and go back to the colony again, 9.2 kilometers. So personally, I would probably cite that, not 9 miles, but 9 kilometers as the maximum, and that's only in cases where there's just a ridiculously plentiful food supply someplace, and they have to be extremely confident that after flying 9.2 kilometers, there's going to be something for them to eat, and then they fly back again. So a typical distance, it's really not that kind of a species. There's nothing typical about tricolored blackbirds. It's sort of a species of extremes. And when food resources are super abundant, like in the caterpillar outbreak year in 2005, we had a grasshopper breakout year up in the Sierra foothills in 2010. We had an 83,000 bird colony in Merced County on a private ranch that I showed you that one really pretty foraging flock of when I said behavior is the best way to discriminate. The birds would come off the nest, the females would come off the nest, they'd flap their wings, glide, and they would be foraging on grasshoppers within 30 seconds. And the cool thing in that particular case, this has never been observed before, instead of flying back to the nest to feed the young, the grasshopper, they were flying to the nearby creek, and they were dunking the grasshoppers in the water. And if you think about, there's 6 different legs, right, on each grasshopper, 6 legs. So multiply that by, say, an average of 3 caterpillars per bill. So now there's 18 different appendages, each of which can hold 1 drop of water, right? So the bird dunks the grasshoppers in the water, flies back from the creek side to the nest, and feeds the young. Great idea. Fabulous. It's almost like taking like a paintbrush or something. It's like a water holder device, right? That's what it's doing. It's dunking the grasshopper in the water and then feeding the young the now quite saturated food. And I'll tell you something. If you're a nestling tricolored blackbird in June in Merced County, you really appreciate it when mom dunks the grasshoppers first, because that's your water supply. If mom brings nothing but a dry grasshopper and you're supposed to swallow it, whew. But if the grasshoppers are all wet, much better, right? Billy, you're going to get a lot of exercise.
Hi, my name is Kelly Barker. I'm also in North Central region here with the department. I'm wondering if there's a minimum acreage for foraging habitat, if you have a good breeding area. And the reason I'm asking is because we're talking a lot with RCDs and with in HCPs in highly agricultural communities about doing native hedgerows. And so if you had a breeding area and you could, I'm sure it depends on prey abundance in those areas, but if you could put in some native hedgerows, would there be a minimum width that you would go to?
What's in there? What's in the hedgerows? What's the vegetation?
It could be whatever you want. Native, it's going to be grasses and forbs mostly, but...
I know a lot more about what the width of the nesting substrate is than I do the foraging substrate. I do know that alfalfa can be a phenomenal source of insects. I did know the landowner in 2006, the colony of 138,000 birds in Kern County that fledged 132,000 young. That colony was supported by 2 80-acre fields of alfalfa. That was a 100% agricultural landscape, and it supported massive numbers of birds. It can be done, but it takes the right pieces all next to each other. So I don't know exactly what a hedgerow might offer on a quote average year. My own work with the species suggests that it really tends towards semiparity, which means that it really doesn't breed very well most years. It really struggles. I've seen, and I first saw it in 2007, I've seen a 50,000 bird colony that was there on Tuesday that didn't exist on Thursday. The birds left. And we had already put it under contract to buy the silage out. It was in a different location in Kern County in 2007. It was literally on the other side of those barns that I showed you from where the colony was in 2006. And where there's not sufficient insects, the females simply can't form eggs. They just can't do it. They need the essential fatty acids and the essential amino acids, or else they just can't do it. So I'd have to have a little bit more knowledge or information about exactly what insect groups are represented in those hedgerows and how many there were. But I know hedgerows are not wide. You know, they tend to be, 30 or 40 feet, maybe, something like that. And I guess it depends upon what's there. If there's a good, sunflowers tend to attract huge numbers of ovipositing females of various lepidopterans, so there's a lot of caterpillars. So if there were native sunflowers or even commercial sunflowers that were growing in there that would attract a lot of female moths and butterflies to oviposit on there, because the caterpillars love to eat the leaves of the sunflowers. And I've gone up to a field right in Yolo County, just a few miles from my house. And it's amazing when tricolors are feeding, because you can literally walk up to them much closer than I am to you right now, much closer. And they don't care. They just keep eating. When food becomes super abundant, it's the only thing they think about, because in most years they're really struggling to find enough food to rear their young. And that's what they're doing. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to make babies. And once the young fledge and they have mouths to feed, boy, do they get focused. And all they do is think about, and if they've got a great big leaf, and I've watched, and you can see a single sunflower leaf that multiple caterpillars on a single leaf. So they can come in and land right on the petiole, and they can feed on multiple caterpillars from one leaf of one plant. So you can stick several thousand tricolors in a very, very small patch of sunflowers, and as long as there's been, during the day or night, you got a lot of females putting their eggs there, and then the eggs hatch, and there's a lot of caterpillars, they can do very well. So the two big insect groups that really support huge numbers of tricolored blackbirds are lepidopterans and grasshoppers, or dopterans. Those are the two groups that just can really support really good breeding by tricolored blackbirds. I don't know how helpful that is, but that's about as specific as I can be.
Thank you. My second question is, I'm fascinated by this reduction in insect population between 2006 and 2007. Have you talked to mosquito abatement programs or entomologists at Davis about what they've seen in that time period? I mean, I don't know if there was a lot of spraying going on for West Nile virus and other things like that.
Yeah, I've only spoken to Art Shapiro. I don't know if you know Art, but he's a character, interesting person. The world's butterfly expert, if you don't know Art. And he hasn't seen it, but there's only one group that he that he studies, as you're aware. And if it's not butterflies, then it's not Art. And apparently butterflies haven't seen that collapse. So whatever the groups were that are found on minivan windshields, those are the groups that are no longer in California, because I just haven't seen it. And I'll be out probably next week for the first time. I just heard just before coming in today of a couple places in Kern County where there's actually birds that are now singing. They're in song chorus, so they're starting to breed. It's in what's called a settlement. Before there's a colony, there's a settlement. They're in a settlement stage right now. So it's in at least part of the range, it's going to be an early year.
Any other questions in the audience? Okay.
So I'm just curious how frequently you've observed this situation where they come in and they build nests, and then either they've determined that the insect population is just not high enough for them to sustain, then they leave, and whether or not that's affected by the survey. So if someone identifies a colony or occupancy, is that then, do you go back and check that? And is that, so what we're seeing may not actually be representative of a successful young being from that colony or from that location?
That is a huge, huge issue with survey accuracy, as you can imagine. And that's why we constrain statewide surveys and this new sample survey that we're going to institute this year to 3 days, Friday through Sunday. And we try to minimize the risk of that happening. In answer to your question, I've seen it repeatedly in more than one location every year since 2007. I didn't see it in 2005. I didn't see it in 2006. I've seen it everywhere I've looked in 2007. I'll give you an example. I've got a retired California Highway Patrol sergeant who has been helping me ban tricolored blackbirds probably for about 5 years now. Her name is Joan Gunterman. And Joan helped me 2 days, Monday and Tuesday, probably in the month of June in 2013. She got out of the car Tuesday morning after helping me band on Monday morning. And before I got out of the car, she said, "Bob, where did all the birds go?" That's how quickly it happens. She's Chip, Highway Patrol. She is not a trained biologist. She got out of the car. She turned towards, this was at Delavan National Wildlife Refuge. She turned towards the refuge. "Bob, where did all the birds go?" Overnight. When they abandon, they're gone. They quit. So I went into the marsh. We had no birds to band. We were there banding birds on Monday. There were no birds left to band on Tuesday, so we didn't band any birds. So I went into the marsh, and I found hundreds and hundreds of nests that were all immaculate. No evidence of eggs ever having been laid, because there weren't any eggs that were laid. They couldn't form eggs. I didn't know that, as a matter of fact, I'm not sure it was known for the species. I didn't know that tricolor females would build nests and not use them until 2007. We put the colony under contract to conserve it from the landowner. Super nice guy, incredibly nice guy, easy to work with, fun to be around, fun to talk to. And I went to monitor the colony for the second time in a week on a Thursday after seeing it on Tuesday. I called Dave Hart, who used to be the, his title was project manager, which I've never quite understood, but at any rate, he was the manager of Kern National Wildlife Refuge. He's now retired. So I called him on my cell phone. I said, "Dave, what happened to the birds?" He said, "What?" I said, "I'm out at the colony that we've put under contract. The field is empty. There's no birds." "What?" I said, "Dave, you don't know?" He said, "No, you're the first person who's told me." He said, "Are you there right now?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "I'll send Pam out." Pam Williams used to work there. She works here in Sacramento now. Probably some of you know her. And she comes out, and we did transects through the field. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of nests, no eggs. Between Tuesday and Thursday, 50,000 birds disappeared, moved somewhere else. But yeah, it's a real issue, and I've seen it. There was a, Rancho Seco, right here in Sacramento County. There was a 20 to 30,000 bird colony that was there, and I had been tipped off by a friend of a friend. And I went up there on a Friday, and it was utterly unlike anything I'd ever seen locally before. I was overjoyed to see so many birds close to Davis. And I made connection with the local consultants.
Amen, but
Is that right?
yeah, I remember going out
Good
there.
example, good choice, right?
It was amazing. It was really cool. And then
And I came back on Monday, and the birds were gone. There were 20 to 30,000 on Friday. I went back on Monday. They were gone. There were no birds. the nests were already built. The nests were there are 3 different types of vegetation. There was willows, there was cattails, and one more, whatever it was. You probably know better than I do. But the birds were gone. They disappeared over the weekend. Presto changeo. Yeah, it happens. I've seen it every year since 2007. Something happened. Something happened in that winter between 2006 and 7, because I've never seen, except in very rare cases, very rare, a really highly productive colony since 2007. And last year in 2014, the first time that anybody who's ever worked with the birds, so it's going all the way back to the 30s, there's been no breeding known in Colusa County. There were 3 of us looking last year. There wasn't a single colony in Colusa County last year. As recently as 2000, I think it was 10 or 11, there was an 80,000 bird colony at Delavan National Wildlife Refuge. Last year, 0 in the entire county. Yuba County, yeah. Colusa County, 0. Private duck clubs, empty. National Wildlife Refuge is empty. No birds. Bad news.
It just seems like there's something else possibly going on other than just the lack of insects, because some of these areas seem like there's plenty of insects, but yet they leave.
Where?
Well, like for instance at Rancho Seco, it seemed like there wasn't a change, a noticeable change.
I walked around. As soon as I saw those birds, I looked at all those grasslands. I said, I wonder what they're eating. I walked around for an hour. I never saw a bug. And when I went to a colony that a landowner in Sacramento County, he contacted me through the portal. And Mike Flores, by the way, he was a president of the Fish and Game Commission prior to Mike Sutton. And now he's a friend of mine. He's a landowner and had tricolored blackbirds nesting on his property. And I went over there and we met, and we were walking through the grasslands around his property together. So I asked him after we were done doing our survey, Mike, how many bugs have you seen? Well, I haven't really been paying attention. I said, okay, pay attention. We walked a few more minutes. He said, I haven't seen any. I said, I haven't either. I said, what are they going to eat? How many are they going to produce if they can't find anything to eat? And that was just, it wasn't native grass, because there's no such thing as native grassland in California to speak of anymore. It's all Eurasian, annual stuff now, but it's just, open rangeland, and we didn't see bugs. I can't explain it. I can just tell you that I've spent a lot of time out looking for insects in California. I mean, an awful lot. And I'm just not finding very many. And what I like to do, and the way that I've done it, there was a paper that I published in Western Birds in 2012 or 13, that I'd like to just get a relative abundance estimate, not an absolute. I can't tell you like how many insects there are per square meter or anything like that. I just rank them in terms of rare and to uncommon to common to abundant kind of a thing. And I just use minutes spent looking. And I actually go and find a foraging group, and I bump them. I bump them off the substrate, and then I go and I walk around and I look to see, what are you guys eating? I'll tell you something. The answer to what are you guys eating is nothing. There's nothing here. And I've actually had people come help me. And it's pretty funny when you see one guy with a master's degree and another guy with a PhD, and they're both on their hands and knees looking in the grass. What are these guys eating? And the answer is, I don't know. Yeah. Crazy. I don't know where the bugs are. As far as I can tell, California doesn't really have too many bugs anymore. Maybe have bees, because we have beekeepers, but we need bees for pollination. But in terms of like the natural groups, we probably have pretty good aquatic insects. I still see a lot of dragonflies, and I've been talking to a few people with a lot of experience with those. The problem with dragonflies, even though they provide really good forage for tricolors, they hatch too late in the year. If you look at when dragonflies are coming off, it's usually in July and August. That's just too late for tricolors. They're done breeding by then. I've been asked why they can't reproduce more just eating a lot of dragonflies. They could if there are a lot more dragonflies that were available in May and June, but they're usually July and August. It's just too late. Tricolors are done.
Any other questions in the audience? Had one on the end. Okay.
Neil.
Yes, for people on WebEx, so they can hear the question.
Hi, Bob. This is just a follow-up to that question. I was hoping you could describe what you see for the rare cases when you had a highly productive colony and you went and found the foraging area and you looked for insects. What did you witness?
Grasshoppers.
How many?
Unlimited numbers. You would take one step and between 50 and 100 would move. You take another step, another 50 or 100 would move. That was that site in Merced County where I said behavior is the best way to discriminate, and then I showed you that picture, that foraging flock of 2,000 or 3,000 birds. And that was in milk thistle, and there was a windstorm. There's a windstorm in California, mark my words, wait until between the 20th and the 30th of May. There will be a windstorm between the 20th and 30th. There is every year. And sometime around the 25th of May, there was a windstorm. 25% of that milk thistle got knocked down by the wind. And yet the reproductive success in that colony was still 1.44. 1.44 young per nest, even after 25% of the milk thistle got knocked down. That was the colony where the females would come off the nest, flap their wings like 2 times, glide to the ground, forage for grasshoppers, fill their bills, fly to the creek, dunk the grasshoppers in the water, and fly back and feed their young. And I'll tell you something, the worst day of my entire professional career was going into that milk thistle when it was about 95 degrees after the young had already fledged, and I had to walk through that colony to count nests. I had at least 3 layers of clothes on. I had welding gloves, right, to protect my hands and my arms. It was 100 and something degrees, or 95 or whatever. It was freaking hot. And I walked through a stand-up milk thistle that was literally 7 or 8 feet tall. And Steve Simmons from Merced, my good buddy, he was just laughing. He took 2 pictures of me. I should have shown you. But he couldn't believe what I was doing. And I walked right through it. I walked right through the milk thistle only to count nests, because you don't know. You have questions that you can't answer unless you do that. And that's why they make beer. Honestly, that's what beer. It's a reward, and it's a good anesthetic too. It's a really good anesthetic, but it's also a reward. Anyway, that's my theory why they make beer.
Okay, any more questions in the audience? I know we have at least 2 WebEx questions. Anyone else in the audience before I go to WebEx? All right, stand by.
But Neil, in answer to your question, there's always one super abundant insect group. It doesn't have to be grasshoppers. It could be caterpillars, and it could be dragonflies, but dragonflies, in almost all cases, just simply hatch off too late. If we could figure out a way to bioengineer dragonflies to produce, their young about a month to 6 weeks earlier, we'd be golden. But in the absence of that, dragonflies are probably not the solution.
Hi, Bob, are you ready?
Yeah.
There's actually 4 questions. I'm over here. Can you see me? 4 questions. The first question is, do cowbirds parasitize the nests of tricolors, and if so, what are the impacts?
I haven't seen it. I've seen tricolors in the area, and it's possible that it occurs in a very, very limited number of cases, but the impact is minimal. I'll tell you one bird that you'll never suspect that in wetlands can have a hugely detrimental effect. Cute little bird, too. Everybody loves them. But for tricolored blackbirds, they're a big, big issue. Anybody know? Neil knows. Don't tell everybody, Neil. Samantha, you know. What are they? Come on, Samantha, you know. Nope. Much smaller. Much, 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 much smaller. Smaller than tricolored blackbirds. Yes. Marsh wrens poke holes in tricolored blackbird eggs by the hundreds, if not the thousands. In wetlands, they're a huge problem. They're really benign looking, right? I mean, who would think that something as small and innocuous as cute as a marsh wren could have such a detrimental effect on California's blackbird, but they do. It's a serious issue, much more serious than cowbirds. Okay, next.
Second question is a two-part question. Initially it says, you discounted the survey efforts of Ted Beatty and his associates as being too vague. Have you compared any of the studies from the 1970s and 80s by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service researchers and ornithologists out of Sac State to your findings? Second question, have you mapped overlays of all of the major survey activities since Neff's original studies?
Okay, the first part, there is no such thing as a Ted Beatty survey. I'm 100% certain that Ted Beatty would never take credit for having conducted a survey. Those surveys were conducted by dozens of people. He was the one, along with Bill Hamilton, who conceived of a statewide survey, but he was one of many, many people who conducted the survey. So that part of it is absolutely incorrect. But the reason that I do not compare directly, I did show you some numbers prior to 2008, but I don't talk directly in terms of comparing results, is for many reasons, but one of which is that the level of effort was much lower then, far fewer people, usually about 30 to 40 people, rather than 100 and something that participated this year. And last time in 2008, we've had much bigger turnout the last three. Data management, infinitely better now that we have the portal. Geographic coverage, knowledge. I showed you how many sites we looked at in 2014, 802. Just 6 years ago, it was 361. So we just know much, much more. People are out there looking for tricolored blackbirds because they know that if they find them, they can enter records of their observations in the portal. That's what the portal's for, to get people excited and motivated to go, use it to document where the birds are. What was the second half of the question?
Have you mapped overlays of all the major survey activities since Neff's original studies?
Mapped overlays of what, to show like a change in distribution? Don't know. The distribution of the species hasn't changed. One thing has changed, which is that the birds are now breeding earlier. We have estimated that over the past, I believe it's 40 years, there's been a 17-day advancement of the initiation of breeding in the species. They start breeding 17 days earlier now than 40 years ago on average. So we're now seeing typically one or two locations in southern Kern County. They're actually starting in February. When I started working with the species in 2005, there were many colonies that hadn't even established yet in mid-April. And I'm going to be in the field probably next week because I've just gotten, like I said, an email just this morning informing me of tricolors that are setting up. They're actually in full song chorus right now. They're setting up, and it's not even March 1st yet. So this year, because of the drought and because we've had some weather that was fairly persistent, I suspect that the initiation of breeding will be advanced even a little bit more than what it had been. But we haven't looked at an overlay like in a GIS context. No, we haven't done any of those kind of analyses. But what we have not seen is we have not seen a shift in the breeding distribution of the species. That's been consistent all the way from the first work done in 1931. Well, that's not quite true. The advent of the dairy industry in the San Joaquin Valley. The dairy industry used to be headquartered in Southern California up until the 1980s. And then in the 1980s, a lot of the dairies shut down in Southern California and they moved to the San Joaquin Valley. So that's when the big dairy industry in Tulare County, Kings County, Kern County, Madera, Merced, that whole industry down there basically just exploded beginning in the mid or early 1980s. And as a result of that, if you look at the tricolored blackbird literature, there's no mention of tricolored blackbirds being in the San Joaquin Valley pre-1980s. And then suddenly in the 1980s, there's just huge, vast numbers of birds being reported. And that's largely because of the dairy industry moving out of Southern California and into the San Joaquin Valley. And I've spoken to two different biologists, one a U.S. Forest Service, and I remember the other one was a consultant, and they both believe that the reason that the number of tricolors in Southern California is now so low, it's because of the absence of the dairy industry. They just, that was their major food source, because the dairymen, once they harvest those grain that they're growing with the triticale because it's such high yield, they store the grain in great big piles in commodity barns or even sometimes outside the barns under tarps, and that just becomes an unlimited food supply, but it's not good for breeding. That's the problem. You can attract birds. They'll come in and they'll actually nest in a triticale. The triticale is a very, very thick stem. It's able to hold a bird's nest, and I've been told that a lot of dairymen are now considering changing from triticale to oats, even though it's got a much lower yield. What's the benefit to the dairymen if they switch from triticale to oats? The oats can't hold a bird nest. They have zero risk of that conflict between birds nesting in their fields and they're getting their grain. So if they grow oats, they know that when they're ready to harvest, they can harvest. There's not going to be any birds in there. They can't. The oats are the stems are too skinny. They can't support a bird's nest. Maybe a sparrow or something like that, but not a blackbird. Billy?
Yeah, so just a comment. We have 4 different questions coming from the same person, so I'm thinking we'll have him coordinate directly with you after we're done here. So the next question is, do you work on any other species?
Currently?
It doesn't say whether it's currently or previously.
I sometimes capture yellow-headed blackbirds. I think I'm the #1 yellow-headed blackbird bander currently in the United States. That's not really my goal, but they like cracked corn, which is what I use for bait. So they come into my traps. I don't know that it really counts that I'm working with them, but it's the only bird species that I'm working with currently. I've done a lot of work with California State Parks, which has to do with species inventories, and that's more or less a kind of a database project. So again, that's not really working with species; it's working with species data. But the only bird that I'm working with in terms of being out in the field and studying actively is a tricolor.
Okay, and then the last question for this setting is there a concern about colony collapse thresholds like the passenger pigeon?
Well, that's a really, really good question, and I've thought about it a lot, and I've seen so wide a range of colony sizes, all of which, they seem to be legitimate colonies. I've seen colonies as few as, 50 or 75 birds, and they were very active. And they built nests, and they laid eggs, and they fledged young, and they did all the things a colony should do. So I don't think so. I don't think we're going to get to that scenario. I do think that what is happening is we are creating an environment, and specifically in Southern California and in the San Joaquin Valley, and it's looking, unfortunately, like maybe along the coast too, where a species that is both colonial and insectivorous in the breeding season can't make it. They just can't make it anymore. And what that means is that the spectacle, the slides that I was showing you, I didn't show you. I've got a video of that 138,000 bird colony, and that can't happen anymore. You guys can't go out with your digital camcorders and get videos of 138,000 bird tricolored blackbird colonies anymore. They don't exist. And all of that has happened in a decade. The collapse from 138,000 being the biggest, 22,000 being the biggest 2 years in a row, all of that has happened in a decade. And I referred to my friend Steve Simmons in Merced County. He and I have worked together since 2008, every year. And we start talking about tricolored blackbirds, and he gets very melancholy because he has seen it. He loves birds. He probably bans more birds than anybody else in North America, #1, just as an individual. He bans several hundred kestrels himself per year, hundreds of them. Yeah. just one species, and he bans wood ducks, and he bans asteroid flycatchers, and he bans lots and lots of other species too. But just kestrels, several hundred. And I talked to him just since we met in '08, and he gets really sad because we go to ranches where we worked together just a few years ago. There were 50,000 bird colonies there. You go to the same ranch now, 2012, 2013, 2014, zero. There's no birds. They have not moved. It would be great if they had, but we'd know about it if they had. It hasn't suddenly become Oregon's blackbird. It is still California's blackbird. There's just far fewer of them. Anybody else?
We have one more question in the audience.
Sorry, I'm sure everybody has things to do. Do you have any examples of successful incentive programs by counties or anybody else for farmers to keep their alfalfa crops or to stay with, crops that would be good in late harvest or do anything that would benefit the species? Any success?
It's a great idea, and it's been suggested, and there are lots of ideas for how to incentivize activities. I think that the opportunities are vast. So far, it's been sort of a handshake under the oak tree kind of a relationship, and that has its limitations since there's not too many of me. There's one of me. There should be probably 50 of me, and if we can get 50 people that are all doing the same thing and they're talking to landowners and they're talking about how to do the right thing by tricolors without, spending money. I know of a guy in Los Angeles County. He spent $5,000 of his own money. A rancher. Very, very, very unlike me politically, as unlike me as they come. And loves tricolored blackbirds. He spent $5,000 out of his own pocket to put in a pond. And under the cover of, I'm not going to mention his name, okay? Under the cover of darkness, he drove to a nearby reservoir to get cattails. He put the cattails in the back of his pickup truck, and he drove back to his ranch, and he put the cattails in his pond because he didn't want to have to wait. He wanted to have cattails in his pond tonight. And that next spring, he did this all on his own. He and I talked, but he didn't tell me he was about to shell out $5,000. And the birds came the next spring. They bred 2 times. Not very many, about 300. But this is in L.A. This is in Leona. Oh, I shouldn't even tell you. Leona Valley. That makes it really easy to figure out who he is. But anyway, that's one person's sort of, But we can sort of take his story and tell his story, and if we can maybe, like you say, incentivize it, actually maybe come up with a way to pay somebody to do that. But the efforts really do need to be made in places where the birds either currently exist or have existed very recently. It's really sort of tantalizing to say, well, I'll just create really high quality tricolored blackbird habitat here. But if there's no history of the birds being near there, that may not be the best thing to do right now. We may want to do that, down the road a piece. But currently, it's so much of a crisis, I think, with just trying to stop the decline. My concern is just where the bottom is. That's my current. I know we're going to go below 100,000. There's just no way we can avoid that. But how much lower, I don't know. But my concern now is I just want to see the decline stopped so that we can at least get it to whatever the bottom is. We reach the bottom, and then we can start building up from there. But whether you're incentivizing it for ranchers who might be thinking about taking Himalayan blackberries out because they perceive some potential conflict now that it's an endangered species, and you might pay them a few hundred or a couple $1,000, whatever it might be to keep the blackberries or to even encourage the blackberries to grow. There's opportunities there, whether it's a private duck club owner, whether it's a rancher, whether it's a dairyman. It's more in the discussion stage than it is applying it on the ground, but the opportunities are vast, all up and down California. Yes.
I was just wondering if you've been in contact with Point Blue Conservation. They actually do have watershed initiative programs that they're starting throughout the state, throughout different counties, working with private landowners, cattle people, agricultural, to make sure that they're finding ways to help benefit bird populations and the cattle industry and other agricultural practices.
My expectation is, Jeff Geipel is a very close friend of mine, and he's one of the principals of Point Blue. And Jeff and I talk tricolors all the time, and we just saw each other last week. And my expectation is there's going to be infinitely more collaboration, very active collaboration between those of us who work with tricolored blackbirds and Point Blue in the future than what there has been in the past. There has been some, but I think the amount and the sort of the intimacy, if you will, of that collaboration, the activity will be much greater in the future. Too much tricolored blackbirds for one day.
Hi, Bob. Yeah, I'm back here again. We have a couple more WebEx questions.
Okay.
Specifically, one that wanted to be asked in front of the audience is, when you mentioned shooting of blackbirds in the fall over rice fields, are you actually talking about the standard varieties of rice as seen in the Sacramento Valley, such as occurs in Colusa and Yola counties, or are you discussing shooting of birds feeding on wild rice in fields that are grown outside of the Central Valley in Shasta and Siskiyou counties?
I've had two different U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service law enforcement officers come to me in Colusa County who have been banding at Delavan National Wildlife Refuge 2 times, 2 different years, to report that they had confiscated carcasses of shot tricolored blackbirds. So that's in Colusa County, and there's no, well, I wouldn't say there's no wild rice, but it's certainly dominated by so-called commercially grown rice. So I know for sure it's happening because the law enforcement officers came to me to tell me that they had shut it down. So the situation at that particular ranch, I just know from the report where there was the 10,800 and some odd, so-called red-winged blackbird shot by the APHIS staff person. That's, it's a publicly available report. What we don't know is how many birds are being shot that are not being reported. There is now an enhanced reporting requirement that just went into effect in the past couple of months, and hopefully that'll be one step towards answering the question of, just how many tricolors might be involved here. But I think the solution really is one of just not shooting blackbirds rather than a better reporting requirement. I think what we're going to end up with is just a better knowledge, a better handle of how many tricolors are being shot. But rather than getting a better handle on how many are being shot, we should just reduce it to 0.
Okay, and the next question is in reference to your statement of they have not moved. Is there a mistaken notion out there that perhaps they have moved?
No. There's been literally not one report which suggests that the birds have moved. Not in eBird, not in a Yahoo News group, not in birding circles, not in professional circles. Zero suggestion by anybody that the birds have moved, that even a small number of birds has moved. Certainly not hundreds of thousands. Yes. They're not saying they have, they're asking. Industry representatives, primarily. Where do they think they moved? They're not suggesting where, they're just putting it out there as the reason that we're not counting them is because they've moved. We're missing them. They're out there somewhere, we're missing them. We're not missing them.
Okay, any other questions? All right, well, thank you very much for your presentation.